All right. Good morning, everyone. My name is Zaina Al-Shaib. I'm the Deputy Director of Communications at the Middle East Institute. I'd like to welcome you all to this on-the-record briefing session in which we will discuss the ramifications of the surge in fighting between Israel and Hezbollah. Cross-border attacks between Israel and Hezbollah have intensified in recent weeks, and the Israeli military has signaled its readiness to potentially launch a large-scale operation deeper into Lebanese territory if Hezbollah does not curtail its strikes. Meanwhile, diplomatic efforts have resulted in little success so far. What are the risks of a full-blown war following the latest round of escalation? To help us analyze all of these developments, I am delighted to welcome Ambassador Gerald Feierstein. He is a distinguished senior fellow on U.S. diplomacy at the Middle East Institute. Eran Etzion, former head of policy planning for the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs and a non-resident scholar at MEI, as well as Charles Lister, MEI's Director of Syria and Countering Terrorism and Extremism programs. Thank you all for joining us this morning.
Thank you. Pleasure.
As many of you might have noticed, unfortunately, our Lebanese panelist, Joyce Karam, could not join this briefing, but we're lucky to have Charles's insight on the panel. When we get to the Q&A portion, you can use the raise hand function on your screen to ask a question. And if you're called on, we will unmute you, and you can introduce yourself and direct your question to our panelists. Questions can also be submitted in writing via the Q&A chat box here on Zoom. Let's get right into it. I'm going to turn to Iran first. Iran, the Israeli foreign minister warned earlier in the week of an all-out war on Hezbollah. The Israeli military said yesterday they approved operational plans for an offensive in Lebanon. Both sides are stepping up the rhetoric. Is an attack imminent? And if so, what are the risks for Israel?
Good evening, everyone. Actually, it's evening here. I'm not sure exactly what it is for you guys. What my reaction is going to be by way of 8 fundamentals that I'm going to go quickly over. And if I exceed my time, just cut me off and I'll, complete later. So here are the 8 fundamentals that I think everyone looking at Israel-Hezbollah right now, or Israel and the wider conflict, should consider. 1, both Hezbollah and Israel do not seek escalation towards total regional war. 2, the nexus, the linkage that Hezbollah and Iran created between Gaza and Lebanon in the current strategic context is not breakable. I mean, it's a fixture. It's here to stay. I don't see anybody that is in a position to kind of extricate this link. And the sequencing of potentially ending the conflict or ceasing the hostilities will have to be as Hezbollah and Iran designed it, which is, Gaza first. Gaza needs to be put into a new situation of ceasefire, and then we can handle Lebanon. Number 3, all the various calculuses of all the actors are in a constant process of examination and re-examination, which is not surprising, but at least with respect to some of them, Israel included, these calculuses are close, in my assessment, to a breaking point, to a changing point. And we can definitely see now scenarios that up until recently, people like me would have said are not really in the cards, such as, yes, spillover to total regional war. Yes, Iran entering the conflict fully or partially or heavily. Israel initiating a third Lebanon war. These are all scenarios that, again, up until recently, I would have said, it's either completely out of question or very low probability. Now, I would be more hesitant. And I would say the calculuses are very delicate, fragile, unstable, and changeable. Number 4, if and when war does erupt, the escalation can be very rapid and very dramatic. And then it's highly doubtful if the US will be in a position to end it without assistance from, I hope you're sitting down, Russia and Iran. Russia is not being mentioned at all in the public discourse, and I think it's a mistake. I'll elaborate maybe later. So we're facing a situation in which if a war does break out, it will, at this very moment, be a failure of American deterrence, both in terms of its deterrence vis-a-vis Iran and Hezbollah, and in terms of its capability or lack thereof to restrain Israel. So this will be at the point of the breakage of the war, and then very quickly it will be proven, doubly so, that the US is not in a position to end it, even if it wants to. And Russia will have a new opportunity to exact a price from the US in order to end the war. Number 5, there is a high probability of what we call multi-front war, including some of it is already happening, but I'm talking about, kind of an escalation. The Houthis, the Iraqi militias, Syria and the Golan, and the massive flow of jihadists from wherever, including Afghanistan, Pakistan, what have you, via Syria into Lebanon and into the Golan front in a situation of such an occurrence. And of course, there will be major disruptions in Arab capitals, such as Cairo, Amman, and so on. And there's a very big question about the West Bank. That was the 5th point. The 6th point, when we look at the end state of such an Israeli-Hezbollah inflagration, the very best scenario I can see is a variation on 1701, but with great difficulty to agree on a mandate for the international force, for the new UNIFIL, and with greater influence of Hezbollah within Lebanon. And there's going to be a major question about the possibility of direct Arab involvement. Kind of, if we take it beyond 1701, a second Taif Accord. Something in the shape and form of an Arab coalition, that more or less what is now being talked about regarding Gaza, but obviously we're talking about Lebanon now. So I think that's going to be a question that's going to come up, because there's no usual suspect beyond UNIFIL that will be in a position to actually kind of give guarantees. And Israel will probably say no to just another UNIFIL. So I think it's going to be an interesting question to look at. And once we look at an Arab coalition entering Lebanon, you're already thinking potentially with the bigger crisis in Lebanon about maybe potentially, boldly looking into a Taif II agreement. Point number 7 is the Iranian involvement. To what extent will it actually enter? As I said before, I think the probability is much higher than before that it will enter, because it has crossed the threshold and because of many other considerations. And then what part will it play, or will it demand, in the conflict ending mechanism? That's a very interesting question that I haven't seen addressed at all. And will there be, in that case, and this is, I know, taking it a step far, but assuming we have had a violent round, like a third Lebanon war, we're now towards the end, we have some sort of negotiations. Can we imagine an Israeli-Iranian de-escalation mechanism? I think that's something very important to discuss. And last, and I'll say it just in 2-3 words, again, looking beyond 1701 and looking at potential outcomes of a major kind of such a regional war, what kind of a regional security architecture can be imagined as a result of all of this? I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Eran. Turning to you, Charles, the Israel-Hezbollah relationship has long been governed by what Eran just mentioned, what's been called the rules of the game, which is essentially restrained fighting. What's at stake for Hezbollah right now?
So first, thanks for that question. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody, depending on where you are. It's good to be part of this briefing and this conversation. hard to really know where to start. There's a million different things to touch upon here. I would say at the outset, and we were discussing this briefly before we brought everybody else into the room, that I think at this point, precisely because of what you just described, Zaina, almost everything in terms of questions around, are we on the brink of a major escalation or not? If we are, what does that look like? What's going to be the trigger? Pretty much everything we're going to discuss at this point is speculation, precisely because the rules of the game have managed to get through the last 8 months without a major escalation. So, like, for example, I agree entirely with what Eran said at the beginning of his remarks, that neither side, neither Israel nor Hezbollah, wants to push things to that brink, to that breaking point. I think that much is certainly clear from the last 8 months. But even despite that, I would go as far as saying we are arguably closer to that point now than we have been at any point over the last 8 months, even despite the fact that the so-called rules of the game remain in place, although I would say they've either become more blurry or the rules have stretched over the last 8 months. But, I think it is important to sort of emphasize and over again that the enormity of that war's potential means that we should treat those kind of sort of blustery predictions with caution every single time we hear them. There really is no underestimating or understating the significance of what a full-scale war would look like. 2006 was very bad. This would be a whole lot worse for both sides. Over the last 8 months, I think we've clearly seen Hezbollah and Israel sort of methodically ratchet up their tactics, their targeting, the use of specific weapon systems. That has been a very gradual and methodical escalation. You can describe that as, again, the rules of the game, but there is also no ignoring the fact that it has steadily escalated with time. Multiple declared and undeclared red lines have been broken over those last 8 months. And there's only so many times that can continue to happen without either a diplomatic resolution, as Amos Hochstein has been trying to put together, or an all-out war. And I think we are reaching that sort of breaking point where the sides are going to have to decide which of those two options they're going to take. Obviously, a week ago, the killing of the Nasser unit leader, Talib Sami Abdullah, was a big sort of escalatory point. The fact that that Hezbollah launched, I think, 215 rockets and drones in about 24 hours following that was unquestionably the biggest action Hezbollah has taken since October last year. And I think speaks, again, to that methodical ratcheting up of what they're willing to do. The release of the Hezbollah drone video flying as far as Haifa, being undetected and able to return back to Lebanon, was similarly part of that game of ratcheting up pressure through propaganda, which Hezbollah has done a relatively good job at over the last 8 months too. I also don't think we should forget the scale or the significance of what's happened over the last 8 months on this front. I think Hezbollah has launched at least 5,000 projectiles into or towards Israel over the last 8 months. That by itself is pretty significant. I think at my count, 10 Israeli civilians and at least 15 IDF have been killed in Hezbollah attacks. And Israeli strikes have killed nearly 350 Hezbollah operatives, which is a rate unprecedented, including the 2006 war. So the significance of what's already happened could potentially, create the impetus or generate the energy necessary for some form of a diplomatic resolution. But to me, it's not really clear that all of the necessary ingredients are there yet for that to happen. And the main reason for that isn't necessarily calculations being made on the Israeli side of the border, but it is Hezbollah and the wider so-called axis of resistance. All the way back to October, in calls like this, the underlying assumption regarding Hezbollah's willingness to enter into an all-out war was always that it would only do that if Hamas was pushed to the brink of a sort of existential defeat. I think we can frankly all say that we're not at that point, and we're unlikely to ever reach that point. And comments from senior IDF officials in media interviews recently, I think, underlined that was always an unreachable strategic goal as far as the IDF was concerned. But from the perspective of the wider axis of resistance, I don't think we should also understate the sense to which there is a perception on that side that what has happened over the last 8 months has actually been an unprecedented achievement for the axis of resistance. Looking globally, Israel's PR nightmare, and that would probably be putting it lightly, is perceived as a strategic victory as far as Iran, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas, all of these many other proxy groups are concerned. That's not a reality that is easy to reverse anytime soon. We've seen the so-called global south mobilize through multilateral bodies like the UN General Assembly in a way that we've never seen before to further that isolation. On top of that, of course, we've seen the ICJ and the ICC development. So all of this, I think, engenders a belief within the wider resistance axis that what has happened over the last 8 months is sufficient. In other words, an all-out war between Hezbollah and Israel is unnecessary. The attritional campaign strategy, from their perspective, is working. There's no need to agree to a ceasefire in Gaza because they can continue to bleed the war. They can continue to rub salt in the wound in terms of the PR situation and what have you, which is, I think, precisely why Sinwar continues to block the ceasefire arrangement. To him, in his mindset, it's totally unnecessary. The death of 35,000 Palestinians in Gaza is a second issue when you take into consideration those broader strategic gains in his mind. I should emphasize, not in mine. And so I think we have to view all of this, the negotiations over a Gaza ceasefire and this issue of the prospects of a Hezbollah-Israel war, through that lens. We're dealing with a different mindset, a different perspective that goes far beyond these more micro issues, the Litani River and negotiations over 30-kilometer changes on a map, or whether or not we're talking about a ceasefire or some form of humanitarian deal in the Gaza Strip. There is a bigger, sort of bigger game here at play, a brutal one, but a bigger one. Briefly, without wanting to take up too much time, of course, I think on the Israeli side of things, I think, and Eran, correct me if I'm wrong, but at least 60,000, if not upwards of 100,000 Israelis remain displaced from the north right now. And that's been for 8 months straight with no let-up. So from Israel's concern, whatever the makeup of the government, that is an unsustainable reality. Schools will go back, I assume, in the fall, and by then, I assume there will be a strong desire for this northern problem to have been resolved one way or the other. But there's really no clear pathway in either direction, whether the diplomatic one or not. We can talk, if we want, in the questions about threats to Cyprus, although I think a lot of that is sort of rhetoric more than anything else. But it is also, I think, a directed threat towards the European Union, which, as a Syria hand here, is already very concerned about increasing instability on the Syria front, with regards to, I think, a now 250% increase in the rate of Syrian refugees heading towards Europe in the last 12 months. If they then have to deal with the war in Lebanon, those numbers are going to spike very, very dramatically. And so I actually think that was Nasrallah's attempt to pull the European Union into part of this conversation, which, frankly, they haven't been up until now, except for French unilateral or diplomatic efforts. Lots of other things to say in terms of what the war might look like, but maybe we can come to that in some follow-up questions.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Charles. Ambassador Feierstein, the U.S. envoy, Amos Hochstein, was in Israel and Lebanon to negotiate a settlement to the current crisis. Clearly, the U.S. is concerned about the latest escalation. What are its primary concerns, and how much leverage and influence does the U.S. Really have, and can it stop this conflict?
Thanks, Zaina, and a pleasure to be with you and the audience today. And the nice thing about going after Eran and Charles is that they pretty much covered the waterfront. I don't have very much to add to their commentary, but if we scroll back to October 7th, October 8th, one of the initial principal points that Joe Biden made when he was discussing the response to the October 7th atrocity was in fact that the primary U.S. objective was to prevent the spread of the conflict. And he said that for a variety of reasons, both in terms of U.S. foreign policy and national security objectives, but also because of our own domestic political situation. And the domestic politics of this have only gotten worse over the last 8 months. The last thing that Joe Biden wants to see is an open conflict between Israel and Hezbollah, which would almost inevitably draw the United States into some kind of engagement. How aggressive, how significant it would be would depend an awful lot on how the conflict plays out. But if the war expands to Israel and Hezbollah, I think it's hard to see how it stops there. How you don't also, in Iran referred to all of this, how you don't draw in the Houthis more aggressively, how you don't see pro-Iranian militias in Iraq becoming engaged, others being drawn into the conflict, Syria and elsewhere, and ultimately the very serious possibility that Iran itself might become engaged. So I think that for the Biden administration, the need to find some way of at least papering over the situation on the Israel-Lebanon border until there is some kind of end to the conflict in Gaza is a primary objective. It's a primary concern. Amos Hochstein is probably the best person to be engaged. He knows the parties on both sides. He has the confidence of parties on both sides, not only the government of Israel, but people like Nabi Berri and others in the Lebanese leadership who have worked closely with Amos over a number of years, primarily on energy-related issues, on negotiations with Israel in the past, the maritime border, and other kinds of initiatives that the U.S. was working on to try to build some kind of de-escalation, confidence-building relationship between Israel and Lebanon that could be significant right now. Eran and Charles both noted 1701, UN Security Council Resolution 1701 from 2006. It does lay out the parameters of what could be a diplomatic step forward. And I think Eran, of course, demonstrated his policy planning chops by going well beyond 1701 and thinking about a lot of possibilities down the road. Those are all important and meaningful ideas, initiatives, objectives. But I think that in the short term, what the U.S. is just trying to do is to keep the situation from spinning further out of control. And 1701 offers a way of accomplishing that. That seems to be where the administration is going. The other point, of course, and we talked a little bit, I'd be very interested myself in hearing Iran's assessment of where Israeli domestic opinion is 8 months into this conflict. It's exhausting. It's the longest period of conflict that Israelis have ever experienced. Are the Israeli public ready for potentially a far more intensive, far more devastating in Israel itself conflict with Hezbollah? What's their thinking about what that might mean for themselves, for their families, for the future of their country? The other point that wasn't mentioned and that has been important over this period, and I think that Charles is exactly right, that as the Iranian leadership, as Hezbollah's leadership, and the others in the axis of resistance look at it, they would come to the conclusion that the current situation, the ops tempo that currently exists between Hezbollah and Israel is about where they want to be. It's about where they need to be. the Iranians have been very clear from the very beginning, including in some quiet, direct engagement with the United States, that they don't want to see the conflict expand. They have, as best we can tell, been fairly aggressive in holding Hezbollah back from escalating any farther. And we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that Iran has its own domestic issues right now, heading into a presidential election after the death of Raisi, and the situation in Iran, I would think, would also not be one that Ayatollah Khamenei would like to see, suddenly having to fight a major conflict with Israel and potentially the United States on top of all of the domestic balls that they're trying to juggle at the moment. So the larger regional environment, and I would add to that as well that I don't think that Israel's neighbors, Egypt, Jordan, the Gulf states, want to see an expansion of the conflict either. They all recognize that the potential for their own internal security, for their own policy objectives, could be severely damaged by a regional conflict. They also will be advocating against any kind of expansion. So you have a regional environment that favors some kind of domestic resolution of the conflict, or at least a domestic placeholder that would allow us to get out of the larger issue of what's going to happen in Gaza, what's going to happen the day after. We can talk about Taif too. We can talk about the potential for the other Arab states to be engaged in some kind of long-term initiative with Lebanon. But I think we also have to be mindful of the fact that with potentially the end to the conflict in Yemen, and potentially the requirements that will be imposed on them for the reconstruction, rehabilitation, governance, security in Gaza, these states that are not, huge and don't have deep benches, to take on a major initiative in Lebanon would be difficult for them, if not impossible, financially, politically, diplomatically. And so again, I think that the larger environment favors diplomacy. Amos Hochstein is working hard, as I think Charles and Eran both noted. We're 8 months into this conflict. It has not expanded yet, despite a lot of heated rhetoric on both sides of the border. And I think personally that while Amos's depiction of the situation, serious but not intractable, I think that that's correct. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Ambassador. All right, at this time, I'd like to open up the discussion to callers on the line. To ask a question, please use the raise hand function on your screen, or just simply submit your question in writing via the Q&A chat box. To start things off, I'll pose a question to Eran. Eran, just to follow up on what Ambassador Feierstein was asking earlier, public opinion within Israel. The displaced civilians within Israel are now 90,000. Their issue has obviously become a toxic one for the country. How do you see the issue getting resolved?
Well, situation in Israel is dire on all fronts, including, of course, the northern front. I think the number one, again, thing to understand if you're looking at Israel from the outside right now is the levels and complexity of the crisis of trust. And I would enumerate 5 different levels of a crisis of trust. One is between the public and the government. Trust in government is probably at an all-time low. It cuts across political figures, party lines, and the vast majority of Israelis do not trust this government, want to see it gone, want to see early elections, are extremely frustrated and distrusting of the government. The second is between the government and the IDF and the entire defense establishment. Here too, it's I hesitate to say it's unprecedented, though it probably is, depending on exactly how you want to measure it and look at it and so on. Everything about this war is unprecedented, including its length and so on. So we never had this kind of a crisis between the government and the military echelons, the highest military echelons, the military command, that has extended for so long, that has extended during a war, with everything that it entails. And though they share, obviously, responsibility to the catastrophe of October 7th and to the botched way that the war has been managed since, they share responsibility, but of course, both of them also, again, there's no symmetry, okay? The professionals, the IDF, the military echelons have taken responsibility, have already said, we will resign. It's only a question of when, but we'll resign. Whereas the prime minister and the members of cabinet, they're in a very different place. They're trying to essentially throw responsibility all over to the army, to the pro-democracy movement, to the Biden administration, to whoever. So that's number two, between the government and the IDF and the defense establishment. Number three is within the government. Within the government, in its former composition, when Gantz and Eisenkot were part of it, obviously there was a lot of distrust, but also within the 64 coalition and within the cabinet, there are extreme tensions that are now blowing up. Immediately after Gantz and Eisenkot left, suddenly you see more and more disruptions within the government. And my personal opinion is it's only a question of time before it completely dissolves. But there's absolutely no trust within the government itself. And Netanyahu yesterday hastily made a video calling desperately for unity within the government and responsibility and so on. Number four is within the IDF and the defense establishment. Also there's a tremendous blame game that's going on within the the Joint Chief of Staff, between various generals, between factions within the army, between those that are more, shall we say, trigger happy, mainly those that emanate from certain messianic disciplines and schools and so on, and those who do not. So there's a whole kind of disruption and mistrust going on there too. And then within the Israeli public, that already before October 7th was completely torn between, the pro-democracy and anti-democracy parts. This is only exacerbated after the war. And even though 80% are united in the demand for early elections and the government to be gone, still between Israelis, there's a lot of disagreement about what is the right thing to do. Should we stop the war and accept the so-called Biden deal or not? Yes, there is a majority that wants to accept it, but it's not like 90 or 80%. It's closer to, 60, 65%. So this is the situation. It's a multi-layered, very deep crisis of trust. It has an overarching impact across all domains. And there's a lot of anxiety, uncertainty, and I could go on and on, but I think you get the picture.
All right, Charles, in the video that Hezbollah published, the 9-minute video of surveillance drone footage showing sensitive Israeli military sites and civilian areas, including in the city of Haifa. How would you assess Hezbollah's capabilities today, and how much of a military threat to Israel does Hezbollah really pose?
So, well, the IDF has come out, I think, publicly and said that this was a capability they were already aware of. I mean, I assume that is probably true, but it's pretty much the only response you can come out with when something like that is put out into the open. But I think nevertheless, there were also a bunch of unnamed officials I saw in the media over the last few days saying nothing like this has happened in the history of the state of Israel. Has an adversary ever flown at will across the territory and monitored sensitive facilities like the Raphael facility not far from Haifa, as well as, of course, the port and the naval base. So I think it's just, as I described it in my opening remarks, the video in and of itself was just another sort of way of ratcheting up the tensions, trying to demonstrate additional capabilities or additional threats. And I think to an extent this is, well, I mean, I think we can list off the numbers that I think probably everybody on the call has heard before. You know, Hezbollah claims to have about 100,000 fighters. You know, US, Israeli, and other intelligence suggest they have a missile and rocket arsenal of at least 150,000, various projectiles of differing capabilities, including precision guidance capabilities. But for me, I think that the understated, underappreciated element here is more on the end of the drones. So that video was sort of telling. There has been, whether we're looking at situations in Yemen, whether we're looking at attacks that we've seen, hundreds of attacks in Iraq and Syria, even rewinding back to attacks on Abqaiq and elsewhere, to an extent, there's been a kind of underappreciation of how rudimentary systems are actually quite capable of doing things and penetrating sophisticated defenses in a way that sophisticated rockets and missiles and drones aren't. If you are capable of deploying even commercially acquirable drones, some of which can fly, you know, 100+ miles an hour for several hours and hug the ground, you've defeated every sophisticated air defense system out there, none of which are capable genuinely of reliably detecting and intercepting things that do that. They may not necessarily be capable of carrying significant explosive payloads, but they are capable, if deployed in significant numbers, of causing the kind of chaos that then allows the more sophisticated and heavy rocket and missile systems to do their damage and overwhelm the air defense systems themselves. So I think that's the added element here that wasn't in play in 2006. And that's the sort of the wild card that I think the Israeli Defense Forces are presumably having to consider. It's one thing for Iran to fire off several hundred long-range drones that fly slow, ballistic missiles that are easily trackable, cruise missiles that are more or less easily trackable and interceptable. It's a whole nother thing to have a swarm of these much more rudimentary systems cross the border all at once and then be followed with the kind of wave of rockets and missiles that Hezbollah would presumably launch. That's a challenge that may be unmanageable, at least in the initial round. So, sort of coming to your question, we can continue to list off all of those big numbers that I listed at the beginning, of which I think everybody knows, but it's actually those wild cards, the asymmetric advantage that is really only ever an advantage in the first round, that Hezbollah does hold. And there are also unanswerable sort of questions and concerns that have developed over the last few years about certain capabilities that may have been acquired via Syria or from Syria, including, dare I say it, chemical weapons technology, which was widely alleged to have been transferred over to Hezbollah 5 or 6 years ago. That's another wild card that nobody can necessarily fully rule out, but if it is in play, makes the situation all the more complicated. So for me, I pay much more attention to those asymmetric, unconventional advantages than I do on the big numbers, because the big numbers in the conventional systems are what Israel can deal with. But it's those other elements that present much more of a complicating factor. As I say, initially in those first or second rounds of an all-out war, more than after that. And let me just throw, a couple other things here into play, which maybe we haven't touched on yet. That this is all sort of worst case scenarios here if war does genuinely break out. But I think it's already been said by one of my colleagues that the Houthis would probably seek to sort of counter escalate if a real war did break out on the Lebanese border. But for me, there's some other interesting elements here. There are, and again, as a Syria hand, many of them are Syrian, or from things on the Syrian side of the border. But the IDF has been very concerned for several years about an Iranian proxy that it calls the Imam Hossein Brigade, a so-called kind of elite special forces type proxy that was developed only for sort of sensitive missions, sensitive attacks on Israel. And it's always been based in Syria. and its primary goal was thought to be to attack American troops at some point. Never happened until now. But there have been some reports that the Imam Hussein Brigade has already been involved in some over-the-border attacks from Lebanon. So if that move has been made to deploy forces that were designed initially to target Americans, and they've now been transferred into Lebanon to join the current rules of the game conflict, I would say that's a concern. Additionally, there's been some speculation around the Fatimiyun and Zainabiyun brigades, tens of thousands of fighters who are currently in Syria, more or less without a mission, in eastern Syria around the Iraqi border. They're kind of holding ground. They are protecting weapons warehouses, but they're not really doing a great deal. But there's been some recent speculation that some of them may also be being transported west. And if that was to happen, that would add a whole nother element to the prospects of what a war would look like. They were the cannon fodder used in major ground warfare in Syria and around Aleppo, for example, in previous years. So, there's these additional asymmetric elements that maybe necessarily haven't been taken into consideration, but could be very relevant if things did go in a bad way.
All right, Ambassador Feierstein, if Israel launches a limited offensive in Lebanon, can it rely on U.S. support?
Yes. I think there's no question that, again, assuming that there is a good level of understanding between the U.S. and Israel in advance, which I assume there would be, at least at the mill level, that the U.S. would certainly support the Israelis. Again, the objective, of course, would be not only to keep it limited in scope, but to keep it limited in time, that it not drag on, that it be more or less a quick in and out, which runs counter, of course, to what Charles was saying, and there. Then you get into this whole question, and I think Charles is right in saying that we're now well into the realm of speculation. In other words, if Israel comes across the border in a major way, does that in itself be sufficient to trigger a wholesale Hezbollah response? Or will Hezbollah's response similarly be restricted in time and scope so that neither side is then committed to this larger conflict that we're talking about, and you still have the potential for some kind of diplomatic effort to get the parties separated, to stand down, to get back into some kind of stasis that is manageable. And that would be the big question. And again, I think then you bring in a lot of other factors. Where are the Iranians? Where are the other Arab states? We can go with Iran's question about what the Russians do. So then a lot of things are in play. But initially, will the U.S. support a limited incursion into Lebanon if there is clear justification for it? The answer is certainly yes.
All right. Before we wrap this up, I do want to ask Eran to, if possible, if you could elaborate on the Russian role, if the opportunity presents itself.
Well, we all understand that the relations between the U.S. and Russia are at a low point because of Ukraine, and there's the bigger issue of the Russian, Iranian, North Korean, Chinese axis, which is being built as a counter axis to the US-EU free world axis. Russia obviously has a presence and a major interest in Syria. It saved Assad. It has no intention to quote unquote let Syria go, or allow Israel, for example, to act on some of its threats, which it makes from time to time, to hit the palace in Damascus and to recreate havoc, if you want, in Syria, which I can assure you, if and when we get to the third Lebanon war, is going to be one of the first things that Israel will either threaten to do or actually do. And the Russians are fully aware of that and are concerned about that. And, you know, looking at the wider picture, imagining a third Lebanon war scenario and thinking about potential conflict ending mechanisms and end states, as I said before, because the US will not be in a position to end it on its own, as compared, if you will, to the second Lebanon war, where the US essentially was in such a position. It played the major role, and yes, it got some assistance here and there, but essentially, you know, it was able to pull it off on its own and bring about 1701 and everything in it pretty much on its own. This is not the world we live in right now. And for the US to try to end this war, they're going to have, and I'm hesitating here, obviously, because it is somewhat speculative, but I think we can safely assume that they're going to need Iran as a direct partner for negotiations on the end state of the war. Iran will surely coordinate with Russia. And so I guess you could have a more limited scenario where this, from a Russian perspective, they will kind of allow Iran to take care of it on its own vis-a-vis the Americans, and you know, Russia will simply be in a supportive role, including obviously in the UN Security Council, or they might choose to play a more active role and exact a price from the US on their own, because they will have an opportunity. And the Russians are great at utilizing strategic opportunities. Now, what kind of price will they be able to exact, depending on, you know, the severity of the situation? It could potentially even be a linkage to the Ukrainian situation. You know, when speaking about conflict ending mechanisms and the parts of 1701 or a new version of 1701, it talks about arms transfers into Lebanon. It's not beyond the imagination to see Russia, you know, kind of willing to negotiate on behalf of Iran and Hezbollah and some of the other militias in Syria on sealing, quote unquote, if there, you know, they wouldn't even probably use this word, but whatever, taking measures on the Syria-Lebanon border to prevent the flow, the free flow of arms shipments, and then Russia trying to link it to arms shipments to Ukraine. So there's an abundance of opportunities for Russia in that scenario. They are present right there. You know, their presence is more significant on the ground than the American presence. Yes, the American presence is more significant at sea, obviously, but you know, the Russians are there, and from their perspective, Syria is a strategic vantage point. They cannot allow Lebanon to become, shall we say, under the influence of the US or Israel, for that matter. And they will take measures, active measures, in order to prevent it from happening. And I think it's very interesting to note how little of all of this is discussed in the context of potential war scenarios in Lebanon. I think it should be discussed more.
I absolutely agree. This is an opportunity for an op-ed. All right, thank you, everyone. We're going to have to wrap things up now. I hope you will join me in thanking Ambassador Feierstein, Eran Etzion, and Charles Lister for participating in this week's session on the intensification of fighting between Israel and Hezbollah. We really appreciate your insight and your willingness to share your morning with us. If you find these calls valuable and want to learn more about other resources MEI can provide, do not hesitate to reach out to us. We would be more than happy to connect. I wish you all the best and hope you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, Zaina.
Thank you.
Zaina.
Thanks, everyone.